Welcome back to another deep exploration into the vast mysteries of the Halo universe. Tonight, we're venturing beyond the familiar conflicts between humanity and the Covenant, beyond even the ancient Forerunners and their ring superweapons. We're going back to the very beginning, to the first philosophy ever conceived in our galaxy, to beings so ancient and powerful that they literally created entire species as acts of will. We're talking about the Precursors and the Mantle of Responsibility. Before we descend into this cosmological rabbit hole, if you enjoy these deep dives into science fiction lore, hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow. Now, settle in. What we're about to discuss rewrites everything you thought you knew about Halo's universe, because the story doesn't begin with humanity discovering the rings, or even with the Forerunners building them. The story begins 10 million years ago with gods who decided they no longer wanted to be gods. The Precursors remain one of the most enigmatic elements in all of Halo lore. We know almost nothing concrete about them. Yet they're responsible for literally everything that happens across the entire saga. They created the Forerunners. They created humanity. They established the philosophical framework that would justify genocide on a galactic scale. And when they were betrayed and destroyed, their revenge became the most horrifying force the galaxy has ever known. The Flood isn't just a parasite, it's the corrupted remains of gods who decided that all life deserved to suffer for the sins of their children. Understanding the Precursors and the Mantle of Responsibility is essential to understanding Halo at its deepest level. This isn't just backstory or world-building flavor. It's the foundational mythology that explains why the Forerunners built the Halo rings, why humanity was targeted, why the Flood exists in the form it does, and what the future of the galaxy might hold. Every major conflict in Halo, every philosophical debate, every moment of cosmic horror traces back to decisions made by beings who existed before recorded history began. The Mantle of Responsibility sounds noble on the surface. It's the idea that advanced species have an obligation to shepherd and protect less advanced life. It's cosmic stewardship, the burden of the powerful to care for the weak. But like all philosophies, its interpretation depends on who wields it and what they believe it justifies. For the Precursors, the mantle was a sacred trust passed between species based on worthiness. For the Forerunners, it became justification for absolute rule and genocidal war. For humanity, it remains a question mark, a destiny we may or may not be worthy to claim. What makes this story so compelling is how it subverts typical science fiction tropes. The Precursors weren't benevolent elder gods guiding younger species toward enlightenment. They were callous creators who built life like a child builds sand castles, beautiful for a moment, but easily destroyed when they grew bored. The Forerunners weren't noble guardians preserving the galaxy. They were usurpers who committed the ultimate betrayal and spent the next 10 million years trying to convince themselves they'd done the right thing. And the flood isn't mindless infection. It's calculated vengeance, cosmic punishment for the sin of killing your creators. The layers of tragedy here are profound. The Forerunners destroyed the Precursors out of fear and jealousy, then tried to live up to the philosophy their victims had taught them. They failed catastrophically, ultimately choosing to destroy all life in the galaxy, rather than let the flood punish them eternally. Humanity inherited this mess without understanding it, spent centuries fighting wars over ancient grudges we didn't comprehend, and now stands at the threshold of claiming the mantle ourselves. But do we deserve it? Can any species truly be worthy of such cosmic responsibility after seeing what it drove the Forerunners to do? These are the questions we'll explore tonight as we trace the history of the first philosophy of the galaxy. From its creation by beings beyond our comprehension, through its corruption into justification for horrors beyond imagination, to its current state as a promise and threat hanging over humanity's future. Chapter 1: Before Time. The Precursors' Nature. To understand the Precursors, we must first accept that we're dealing with beings who operated on a level so far beyond conventional life that calling them aliens doesn't capture their nature. They weren't a species in any meaningful sense. They were something else, something that existed in ways that violate our understanding of physics, biology, and reality itself. The Precursors' origins stretch back through time in ways that challenge understanding. Some accounts suggest they may have existed before the current age of the universe itself, though the exact timeline remains uncertain. While other civilizations rose and fell, while galaxies formed and stars ignited, the Precursors remained constant. They weren't bound by normal lifespans or biological limitations. Some accounts suggest they were essentially immortal, maintaining continuity of consciousness across timeframes that would make even the Forerunners' 100,000-year lifespans look insignificant. Their technology, if you can call it that, was indistinguishable from magic. They didn't build ships or structures in any conventional sense. They manipulated space and time directly, treating physical reality as something mutable and temporary. Neural physics, the science they pioneered, allowed matter and thought to interact in ways that our understanding of the universe says should be impossible. They could create life from nothing, reshape existing species, traverse vast distances instantaneously, and even apparently exist outside normal space-time. But the most significant aspect of the Precursors wasn't their power, it was their philosophy. They believed that advanced life had an obligation to shepherd less advanced life, to guide evolution, to nurture potential, and to ensure that consciousness proliferated throughout the universe. This was the Mantle of Responsibility in its original conception, a sacred duty that the most advanced beings bore willingly because they understood their place in the cosmic order. The Precursors didn't just theorize about this philosophy, they implemented it actively. They seeded life throughout the galaxy, creating species after species as experiments in consciousness and evolution. Some they crafted carefully, designing every aspect of their biology and psychology. Others they created more casually, setting initial conditions and letting evolution take its course. The galaxy became their garden, filled with countless forms of life, each representing a different approach to the fundamental questions of existence. Among their many creations, 2 species would become particularly significant. The Forerunners were crafted to be powerful, long-lived, technologically brilliant. They were given advantages that would allow them to spread across the galaxy, to build great civilizations, to potentially one day inherit the mantle themselves. And for millions of years, the Forerunners were the Precursors' favored children, the species that seemed most likely to prove worthy of this cosmic inheritance. But the Precursors created another species, one that initially seemed less impressive. Ancient humanity was given different gifts. Where the Forerunners received longevity and technological aptitude, humans received adaptability and resilience. Where Forerunners were methodical and hierarchical, humans were creative and individualistic. For millions of years, this hardly seemed to matter. The Forerunners built a vast interstellar empire, while humanity remained relatively confined and less advanced. Then something changed. The Precursors began to observe both species more carefully, evaluating them not just on their achievements, but on their fundamental nature, their potential, their worthiness to eventually inherit the mantle. And in this evaluation, the Precursors made a decision that would doom them and reshape galactic history forever. They chose humanity. We don't know exactly what criteria the Precursors used to make this judgment. The fragmentary records that survive, mostly from Forerunner sources understandably bitter about the decision, suggest it wasn't about technological advancement or territorial expansion. The Precursors seemed to value something else, perhaps the diversity of human culture, perhaps our capacity for change, perhaps something ineffable that they perceived but couldn't easily articulate. What we know for certain is that the Precursors informed the Forerunners of this decision. They told their firstborn species, the children they'd crafted and nurtured for millions of years, that they were to be passed over. The Mantle of Responsibility would not be inherited by the Forerunners. Instead, it would be given to humanity, the younger species who the Forerunners likely viewed as inferior in every measurable way. The Forerunner reaction was complex and ultimately catastrophic. On the surface, many Forerunners accepted the decision with appropriate deference to their creators. But underneath, resentment festered. They'd built an empire spanning millions of worlds. They'd elevated countless species through careful stewardship. They'd embodied the principles of the mantle for ages. And now they were being told that all of this was insufficient, that another species, one less advanced and less accomplished, would inherit the sacred duty they'd spent eons preparing to receive. Some Forerunner philosophers and leaders argued for acceptance. The Precursors were their creators, essentially gods by any reasonable definition. If they judged humanity more worthy, then surely their judgment must be respected. To do otherwise would be to reject the very basis of the mantle itself, the idea that worthiness mattered more than power. But other Forerunners, particularly among the military leadership, took a different view. They began to question the Precursors themselves. Were beings this powerful really benevolent? Did they truly have the galaxy's best interests at heart? Or were they capricious gods playing with lesser species for their own inscrutable purposes? The decision to favor humanity seemed arbitrary, unjustifiable by any objective measure. Perhaps the Precursors weren't wise guardians, but dangerous tyrants whose power exceeded their wisdom. This questioning led to something unprecedented. The Forerunners began to plan rebellion, not openly at first, but in secret councils and whispered conversations. They began to ask a question that no created species had apparently asked before. What if we destroyed our creators? The technical challenge was enormous. The Precursors were essentially omnipotent by Forerunner standards. They manipulated reality itself through neural physics. They existed in ways that made them difficult to target or even perceive properly. Fighting them seemed not just suicidal, but literally impossible. Yet the Forerunners found weaknesses, or perhaps the Precursors, in their arrogance or their trust, allowed weaknesses to exist. The Precursors' greatest vulnerability was philosophical rather than physical. They believed deeply in the sanctity of life and the sacred trust between creator and created. The possibility that their children would turn on them seems to have been outside their conceptual framework. They'd created the Forerunners to eventually inherit the mantle, to become shepherds of lesser life. The idea that these created beings would instead become murderers of their creators was so contrary to the mantle's principles that the Precursors apparently couldn't conceive of it happening. This blind spot proved fatal. When the Forerunner rebellion came, it came suddenly and with overwhelming force. Using weapons specifically designed to disrupt neural physics, the Forerunner struck at Precursor installations and concentrations throughout the galaxy. The war, if it can be called that, was brief and devastating. The Precursors, despite their immense power, were unprepared for violence from their own children. Many were destroyed outright, their exotic biology disrupted beyond recovery. But the Forerunners' victory wasn't complete. Some Precursors escaped the initial attacks, fleeing beyond the galaxy to locations the Forerunners couldn't follow or couldn't find. Others went into hiding in various forms, using their mastery of neural physics to preserve themselves in states that the Forerunners couldn't detect or destroy. And some, in their final moments, chose a particular form of preservation that would have consequences beyond anything the Forerunners imagined. The Precursors discovered that their exotic biology, based on neural physics and existing partially outside normal reality, could be preserved in powder form. This wasn't death exactly, but a kind of suspended animation that could theoretically last indefinitely. In this state, they would remain dormant but intact, waiting to be reconstituted at some future time when conditions allowed. Vast quantities of this powder were created and hidden throughout the galaxy, a backup plan in case the Forerunner rebellion succeeded. But the Forerunners had committed an act so fundamentally wrong, so opposed to every principle the Precursors had taught, that it literally poisoned the preservation method. The powder, meant to allow the Precursors to return, became corrupted. Whether this was intentional, a curse laid by dying gods on their murderous children, or unintentional, a side effect of the immense spiritual violation the Forerunners had committed, remains unclear. What's certain is that when some of this powder was eventually reconstituted, what emerged wasn't precursors restored to their former state. It was something twisted, something that had been driven mad by millions of years of dormant consciousness stewing in hatred and desire for revenge. The precursors who'd fled beyond the galaxy and those who'd hidden successfully would play roles in future events, but the corrupted powder, the poisoned remains of murdered gods, would become something far worse than the precursors had ever been in their original form. It would become patient zero for the Flood, the most horrifying force the galaxy would ever face. Chapter 2: The Mantle of Responsibility. At its core, the Mantle of Responsibility was a beautiful idea. It proposed that the most advanced species in the galaxy had an obligation to protect and guide less advanced life, to act as shepherds and stewards, to ensure that consciousness and diversity flourished throughout the cosmos. It was cosmic altruism codified into philosophy, the acceptance that great power came with great responsibility on a galactic scale. The precursors developed this philosophy over billions of years of existence. They'd seen countless species rise and fall, had observed how advanced civilizations could either nurture or destroy developing life. The mantle was their conclusion about the ethical path forward, their answer to the fundamental question of what advanced beings should do with their power. In the precursors' original conception, the mantle wasn't about dominance or control. It was about service and sacrifice. The species that bore the mantle accepted limitations on their own freedom for the benefit of others. They would forego certain technologies or expansions if those would harm developing species. They would intervene to prevent extinctions, guide evolution in beneficial directions, and generally ensure that the galaxy remained a place where diverse forms of life could flourish. Critically, the mantle was supposed to be temporary for any given species. The precursors didn't see themselves as eternal rulers, but as caretakers who would one day pass their responsibility to worthy successors. They believed in the potential of life to evolve, not just biologically, but philosophically and spiritually. Eventually, a created species would demonstrate sufficient wisdom, compassion, and capability to inherit the mantle. At that point, the precursors would step back, allowing the new bearers to take up the sacred duty. This cyclical view of cosmic responsibility was central to how the Precursors understood their role. They weren't meant to rule forever. They were meant to guide until guidance was no longer needed, then pass the torch to those they'd nurtured. It was humility on a cosmic scale, the acknowledgement that even beings as advanced as the Precursors weren't the end point of evolution, but merely another step in an ongoing process. The mantle also came with specific principles that defined how it should be wielded. First and foremost was the protection of biodiversity. Every species, no matter how seemingly insignificant, represented a unique expression of life that deserved preservation. The bearer of the mantle had an obligation to ensure that extinction happened only through natural processes, never through negligence or malice from advanced civilizations. Second was the principle of minimal interference. While the mantle justified intervention to protect life, it didn't justify controlling every aspect of how that life developed. Developing species should be allowed to make their own choices, even when those choices seemed unwise to more advanced observers. The goal was to preserve potential, not to micromanage every civilization's growth. Third was the acceptance of sacrifice. Bearing the mantle meant accepting costs and limitations that a species focused solely on its own interests wouldn't accept. Resources that could be used for expansion might instead go to protecting endangered species. Technologies that could provide advantages might be restricted if they posed risks to less advanced life. The mantle bearer had to put the health of the galactic ecosystem above their own immediate interests. Fourth was the evaluation of worthiness. The mantle wasn't meant to be inherited through conquest or claimed through power. It was a sacred trust that should be passed only to species who demonstrated genuine commitment to its principles. Worthiness was judged not by technological achievement or territorial control, but by character, by how a species treated other life, by whether they showed the wisdom and compassion necessary for cosmic stewardship. These principles created a framework for galactic civilization that was fundamentally altruistic. If followed sincerely, the mantle would ensure that the galaxy remained diverse, that developing species were protected, and that power was wielded responsibly by those most capable of handling it. It was an answer to the great filter problem, the question of why advanced civilizations don't destroy themselves or others. With the mantle, they wouldn't, because they'd be bound by philosophy to act responsibly. The Precursors taught these principles to the Forerunners for millions of years. They weren't just giving them technology or territory. They were preparing them to potentially one day inherit cosmic responsibility. The Forerunners were meant to be students of the mantle, learning through observation and practice what it meant to be shepherds of life. And for a long time, this education seemed successful. The Forerunners did act as protectors of lesser species, They prevented extinctions, guided developing civilizations, maintained the biodiversity of countless worlds. They built a society structured around the idea that they were stewards rather than conquerors, that their power came with obligations to those less powerful. The mantle wasn't just philosophy to them. It was the foundation of their entire civilization. But there was a problem that the Precursors perhaps didn't fully appreciate. They'd created a philosophy that required genuine humility and selflessness, then taught it to a species that had essentially unlimited power over the rest of the galaxy. The Forerunners were so advanced compared to every other species that the practical difference between stewarding them and controlling them became very small. Good intentions only go so far when you have the power to reshape entire worlds on a whim. Over millions of years, the Forerunners' interpretation of the mantle gradually shifted. They still spoke of stewardship and protection, still claimed to act in the best interests of lesser species, but their actions increasingly reflected the assumption that they knew what was best for everyone, that their judgment was inherently superior, that disagreement with Forerunner decisions was essentially proof of unworthiness. Some Forerunner thinkers recognized this drift and tried to address it. They argued that the mantle required more than just protecting other species. It required respecting their autonomy, accepting that different forms of consciousness might have different but equally valid perspectives, admitting the limits of Forerunner wisdom. These reformers tried to push their civilization back toward the Precursors' original vision, but they were fighting against powerful forces. The Forerunner rate system, their caste-based social structure, created classes of individuals whose entire identity was built around the assumption of Forerunner superiority. The Builder rate, responsible for galactic infrastructure, saw themselves as architects of cosmic order. The Warrior Servants saw themselves as protectors against chaos. The idea that they might not be the rightful inheritors of the mantle, that another species might be more worthy, was existentially threatening to these groups. When the Precursors decided to pass the mantle to humanity instead of the Forerunners, they were making a judgment about this drift. They'd observed that the Forerunners, despite their achievements and good intentions, had lost sight of the mantle's core principles. They'd become too convinced of their own righteousness, too willing to make decisions for others, too unable to accept that worthiness might be defined differently than they believed. Humanity, in the Precursors' evaluation, showed characteristics that the Forerunners had lost or never possessed. Humans were more diverse in their thinking, less hierarchical in their organization, more willing to question authority and tradition. Where Forerunner society was built on stability and order, human society embraced change and chaos. Where Forerunners sought to perfect and preserve, humans sought to explore and transform. From the Precursors' perspective, these human characteristics made them better suited to bear the mantle. The galaxy didn't need eternal order imposed from above. It needed guardians who understood that life was messy and unpredictable, who wouldn't try to force everything into neat categories, who could protect biodiversity without smothering it under well-intentioned control. But this decision, however well-reasoned from the Precursors' perspective, ignored a crucial reality. The Forerunners had spent millions of years believing they were destined to inherit the mantle. Their entire civilization was structured around this assumption. To tell them now that they weren't worthy, that another, less advanced species would inherit what they'd prepared for so long to receive, was devastating to their collective identity. The Mantle of Responsibility, created to prevent conflict and ensure wise stewardship, instead became the cause of the most catastrophic act of violence the galaxy had ever seen. The Forerunners' murder of the Precursors was, in a twisted way, a perverse expression of mantle thinking. If the Precursors were making such obviously wrong judgments, if they were going to give cosmic responsibility to an unworthy species, then perhaps they weren't fit to hold the mantle themselves. Perhaps the Forerunners had to take it by force to prevent a greater catastrophe. This rationalization ignored the fundamental principle that the mantle was supposed to teach. You couldn't claim worthiness through violence. You couldn't prove your fitness to shepherd life by murdering your creators. The very act of the Forerunner rebellion demonstrated exactly why the Precursors had judged them unworthy. But by the time the Forerunners realized this, if they ever truly did, it was far too late. The deed was done. The Precursors were destroyed or driven away, and the Forerunners were left to bear a mantle they'd stolen rather than inherited. Chapter 3. The Forerunner Betrayal. The decision to rebel against the Precursors wasn't made lightly or unanimously. Forerunner society was thrown into its greatest crisis, with different rates and factions taking radically different positions on what should be done about the Precursors' judgment. This internal conflict reveals much about how the mantle had already been distorted in Forerunner thinking. The warrior servants, the rate responsible for military matters, were among the strongest advocates for rebellion. Led by the Didact, who would become the most infamous Forerunner in history, they argued from a position of pragmatic power politics. The Precursors' decision to favor humanity was strategically dangerous to Forerunner civilization. If humanity was given the mantle, they would eventually have authority over the Forerunners, despite being less advanced. This inversion of the natural order, with the less advanced commanding the more advanced, would inevitably lead to conflict. Better to resolve the issue now, while the Forerunners still held overwhelming advantage. The warrior servants also questioned the Precursors' judgment on tactical grounds. Humanity showed concerning tendencies toward aggression and expansion. Their history was filled with conflicts, their psychology less stable than the Forerunners. Giving such a species cosmic responsibility seemed dangerously naive. The Precursors, for all their power, might not truly understand the practical requirements of galactic stewardship. Perhaps their billions of years of existence had left them out of touch with the realities of maintaining order among numerous spacefaring species. The Builders, led by the master builder Faber, supported rebellion but for different reasons. They saw the Precursors' decision as proof that the old gods were no longer competent to shape galactic destiny. The universe needed order, stability, grand structures that would last eons. The Builders provided these things through their monumental constructions and careful planning. The Precursors, with their chaotic neural physics and apparent whimsy in choosing humanity, represented disorder. The galaxy would be better served by clear Forerunner rule than by waiting for the Precursors to hand power to an unproven species. The builders also had economic and practical concerns. Forerunner civilization had invested enormous resources in infrastructure throughout the galaxy. If humanity inherited the mantle, what would happen to these investments? Would humans respect Forerunner property claims? Would they understand and maintain the complex systems the builders had created? The uncertainty was threatening to builder interests, making rebellion attractive from a purely practical standpoint. Not all Forerunners supported the rebellion. The lifeworkers, responsible for studying and preserving biological diversity, were deeply troubled by the proposal to destroy the Precursors. The librarian, who would become the most noble Forerunner in history, and the didact's wife, argued passionately against rebellion. She pointed out that destroying their creators would violate every principle of the mantle. If they weren't worthy according to Precursor judgment, then murdering the judges wouldn't change that fact. It would only prove the judgment correct. The lifeworkers also raised practical objections. The Precursors' mastery of neural physics and their understanding of life itself was far beyond Forerunner capabilities. Destroying them meant losing irreplaceable knowledge. Even if the Forerunners succeeded in seizing the mantle by force, they would be cosmic stewards without the wisdom or tools that the Precursors would have provided to proper inheritors. They would be children playing at being adults, with galactic consequences for their inevitable mistakes. The miners and other rates had mixed positions. Some saw opportunity in rebellion, a chance to reshape Forerunner society without Precursor oversight. Others feared the consequences of such cosmic hubris. The debates raged for what might have been years or decades, with Forerunner civilization tearing itself apart over what to do about their creator's judgment. Ultimately, the militarist faction won. This wasn't because their arguments were necessarily more persuasive, but because they controlled the weapons and warriors necessary to act on their position. The didact and his warrior servants, backed by the Master Builder's resources, moved forward with plans to eliminate the Precursors. Those Forerunners who opposed the rebellion could protest, but they couldn't prevent it. The die was cast. The weapons used against the Precursors were specifically designed to disrupt neural physics. Standard Forerunner armaments, as advanced as they were, wouldn't be effective against beings who existed partially outside normal reality. But the Forerunners had studied Precursor technology for millions of years, had learned at least the basics of how neural physics worked. They couldn't replicate it, but they could disrupt it, could introduce dissonance that would prevent Precursor structures and even bodies from maintaining coherence. These weapons, whose details remain fragmentary in surviving records, appear to have functioned by targeting the boundary between normal space and the higher dimensions where Precursor technology operated. By destabilizing this boundary, they could cause catastrophic failures in anything relying on neural physics. Precursor vessels would lose cohesion. Their installations would collapse. Even their bodies, existing in multiple states simultaneously, would be forced into single states where they could be destroyed by conventional means. The first strikes came without warning. Precursor facilities throughout the galaxy were hit simultaneously, suggesting coordination and planning on a massive scale. The Forerunners weren't just attacking military targets, they were attempting genocide, trying to eliminate their creators entirely. Every precursor installation, every known location where they gathered, every world they were known to have transformed was targeted. The precursors' response, or lack thereof, remains one of the most puzzling aspects of this event. They possessed technology far beyond the Forerunners. They'd created the Forerunners in the first place, and presumably could have destroyed them just as easily. Yet according to Forerunner records, the Precursors barely fought back. Some fled. Others allowed themselves to be destroyed. But large-scale organized resistance never materialized. Several theories exist to explain this passivity. Perhaps the Precursors were so philosophically committed to nonviolence that they couldn't bring themselves to fight their own creations, even in self-defense. Perhaps they saw the Forerunner rebellion as a kind of natural selection, a test that would determine whether anyone truly deserved the mantle. Perhaps they were so confident in their contingency plans, in their ability to preserve themselves and return later, that immediate resistance seemed unnecessary. Or perhaps the Precursors simply didn't believe what was happening. They'd spent billions of years as the undisputed masters of the galaxy. They'd created countless species, nurtured civilizations, guided evolution. The possibility that their own creations would turn on them might have been so contrary to their understanding of how the universe worked that they couldn't process it until too late. By the time they realized the Forerunners were serious, the damage was already catastrophic. Whatever the reason, the result was devastating. Within a relatively short period, possibly just years, the Precursors were eliminated as an active presence in the galaxy. Those who weren't killed outright fled beyond the galactic rim to places the Forerunners couldn't or wouldn't follow. Others transformed themselves into the powder, hoping to wait out the crisis and reconstitute later. The rest simply died, murdered by the children they'd created and nurtured. The Forerunners' immediate reaction to their victory was complex. Some celebrated, believing they'd freed the galaxy from capricious gods who didn't truly understand what was best for the species they'd created. Others were horrified, recognizing that they'd committed an act so fundamentally evil that no rationalization could justify it. And some simply felt numb, unable to process the magnitude of what they'd done. In the aftermath, Forerunner civilization had to decide how to move forward. They'd seized the mantle by force, proving themselves unworthy in the very act of claiming worthiness. They'd destroyed beings of immense knowledge and power, losing access to wisdom they would desperately need. They'd committed what might literally be the greatest crime in galactic history. How were they supposed to proceed from here? The solution they chose was denial and revisionism. The official Forerunner historical narrative began to change. The Precursors were portrayed not as benevolent creators, but as dangerous entities whose judgment couldn't be trusted. The decision to favor humanity was framed as proof of Precursor instability or malice. The rebellion was cast as necessary self-defense or even preemptive strike against beings who might have destroyed the Forerunners if given the chance. This revised narrative allowed most Forerunners to live with what they'd done. They could tell themselves they'd acted righteously, that destroying the Precursors had been necessary to preserve order and protect the galaxy from flogged stewardship. They'd saved civilization from the Precursors' poor judgment. They'd proven through their victory that they were stronger and therefore more fit to bear the mantle. But this narrative was built on lies that would eventually collapse under their own weight. Some Forerunners, particularly among the life workers, knew the truth and couldn't forget it. They'd murdered their creators. They'd violated every principle the mantle was supposed to represent. And one day, they would pay for it. That payment would come in the form of the flood, the corrupted remains of Precursors who'd preserved themselves in powder form. But that catastrophe was still millions of years away. In the meantime, the Forerunners would build an empire across the galaxy, would elevate countless species, would create wonders of art and technology. They would try desperately to prove they deserved the mantle they'd stolen. And they would fail over and over, because worthiness can't be achieved through accomplishment when the foundation is built on the ultimate betrayal. Chapter 4: The Corruption and the Flood. For millions of years after the Forerunner rebellion, the galaxy seemed stable. The Forerunners built their empire, developed incredible technologies, guided younger species according to their interpretation of the mantle. They created the Ecumene, a vast interstellar civilization that encompassed millions of worlds and numerous client species. By any objective measure, they'd succeeded in becoming cosmic stewards, proving through their actions that they could bear the burden of responsibility. But buried throughout the galaxy, hidden in countless locations, the Precursors' contingency plan was slowly going wrong. The powder they'd transformed themselves into meant to preserve their consciousness until conditions allowed reconstitution was degrading. Not physically, the substance remained stable across millions of years, but spiritually or metaphysically, the consciousness preserved within was changing, warping under the weight of time and the trauma of betrayal. The exact mechanism of this corruption remains unclear. Forerunner scientists who later studied the phenomenon proposed that neural physics, the exotic science the Precursors had mastered, wasn't meant to preserve consciousness across such vast timescales in this particular form. The powder was a stopgap measure, good for perhaps thousands or even tens of thousands of years, but not for millions. Like a recording degraded through countless generations of copying, the precursor consciousness in the powder lost fidelity, became distorted. But other interpretations suggest something more deliberate. Perhaps the precursors who transformed into powder did so knowing they would be corrupted. Perhaps this was intentional. A curse laid on the galaxy that had rejected them. They couldn't fight back directly, couldn't prevent their own destruction, but they could ensure that their murderers would eventually face consequences beyond imagination. The powder wasn't meant to preserve them. It was meant to become something worse than they'd ever been. Something that would punish the Forerunners for their sin. Regardless of whether the corruption was accident or design, its effects were catastrophic. The precursor consciousness in the powder, preserved across millions of years, had time to contemplate what had been done to them. They'd been creators, nurturers, shepherds of life. They'd spent billions of years fostering consciousness throughout the galaxy, and their reward for this cosmic service was betrayal and murder by their own children. This extended contemplation in suspended form led to a fundamental shift in philosophy. The precursors had believed in the sanctity of life, in diversity and potential. They'd created countless species as expressions of the universe's creative impulse. But now, corrupted by millions of years of dormant consciousness stewing in betrayal, they reached a different conclusion. Life itself was the problem. Consciousness was the disease. Creation had been a mistake. The corrupted precursor remnants came to believe that the only way to correct the fundamental flaw in the universe was to consume all life, to absorb all consciousness, to reduce everything back to a unified state. This wasn't extinction in the traditional sense. It was grotesque unity. All separate beings merged into a single, horrifying collective that would suffer eternally together. The punishment for the sin of the Forerunners, and by extension, all life that had continued to exist after their betrayal was to become one in agony. When the powder was eventually encountered by organic life, when conditions allowed it to interact with living tissue, it didn't reconstitute precursors. Instead, it created something new. The flood, a parasite that spread through infection, that consumed biomass and neural tissue, that transformed its hosts into extensions of a unified intelligence. But calling the flood a parasite doesn't capture its true nature. It was weaponized philosophy, the precursors' original beliefs about unity and interconnectedness twisted into their darkest possible form. The flood's first appearance in the galaxy came not as a massive outbreak, but through an unsettling discovery. Around 107,445 BCE, ancient humans, during their own expanding civilization, encountered strange powder in containers aboard derelict vessels at the galaxy's edge. When this powder came into contact with domesticated animals, it initially seemed beneficial, making the pets more docile and well-behaved. Humanity, unaware of what they were dealing with, continued to expose their animals to the substance. It's darkly ironic that humanity, The species the Precursors had chosen to inherit the mantle became the vector for the corrupted Precursors' return. The flood spread through human space rapidly, initially seeming like just an aggressive disease. Infected individuals would develop strange growths. Their behavior would change. They'd become violent. But this was just the beginning. The flood establishing its foothold before revealing its true nature. As the infection spread and accumulated sufficient biomass, something terrifying emerged. The flood developed coordination that exceeded anything a simple parasite should possess. Infected individuals acted in concert with disturbing efficiency. They showed tactical intelligence, strategic planning, even appeared to communicate complex ideas despite having no apparent means to do so. This wasn't a disease. It was an intelligence, ancient and malevolent, that was learning how to use biological life as puppets. The ancient human civilization, at its height, rivaling the Forerunners in power and sophistication, found itself facing an existential threat. Every world the flood touched became a nightmare. Populations would be infected in days. Entire planets transformed into pulsating biomass as the flood consumed and repurposed every living thing. The infected dead weren't corpses. They were warriors in the flood's army, shambling horrors that retained enough of their original form to be recognizable while being completely controlled by the collective intelligence. Humanity fought desperately against this plague. They tried quarantine measures, but the flood found ways to breach any containment. They tried medical solutions, but the flood adapted faster than any conventional pathogen. They tried sterilizing infected worlds, burning away all life to stop the spread. But the flood could survive in spore form, waiting in dormancy until new hosts arrived. Every strategy failed. Every victory was temporary. The flood just kept spreading. In their desperation, ancient humans attempted to find any solution. According to some accounts, they developed a genetic countermeasure, altering a third of their population and placing them in the flood's path. What happened next appeared miraculous. The flood began to retreat. Entire sectors that had been consumed suddenly went quiet. Human worlds within flood-controlled space were found healthy and intact. The humans believed they'd succeeded, that their genetic engineering had created resistance or immunity. This apparent victory came at enormous cost. They'd sacrificed countless worlds and a third of their population. But they'd seemingly found a way to defeat the parasite. They destroyed all their research data as the Forerunner assault intensified, perhaps as a final act of spite against the civilization that wouldn't believe their warnings. But there was a horrifying truth that wouldn't be discovered until much later. There was no cure. The flood had deliberately stopped infecting humans. It was a calculated deception, designed to make the Forerunners believe a solution existed, diverting their future efforts toward finding this non-existent cure, rather than focusing on more effective containment strategies. This included Forerunner client species. Ancient humanity, in its fight for survival, was exterminating civilizations that the Forerunners had spent millennia nurturing. From the human perspective, this was tragic but necessary. These species would be consumed by the flood eventually anyway. Better a quick death now than the horror of flood transformation later. And crucially, their sacrifice might provide the data needed to save the rest of the galaxy. But from the Forerunner perspective, this looked like unprovoked aggression. They didn't know about the flood. Humanity's desperate fight was happening on the galactic frontier, in regions the Forerunners barely monitored. All the Forerunners saw was humanity suddenly attacking and destroying worlds under Forerunner protection. It was a violation of everything the Mantle stood for, proof that the Precursors' judgment had been catastrophically wrong. The Forerunners demanded explanations. Humanity tried to warn them about the flood, to share their research, to explain that they were fighting for survival against something far worse than territorial expansion. But the Forerunners, still guilty about their betrayal of the Precursors and defensive about their claim to the Mantle, interpreted human warnings as excuses. They'd heard justifications for atrocity before, had used them themselves. They didn't believe humanity was fighting some unknown threat. They believed humans were showing their true nature as the aggressive, unworthy species the Forerunners had always suspected. This catastrophic failure of communication led to war. The Human-Forerunner. War was brutal and one-sided once the Forerunners committed their full military might. Ancient humanity was already exhausted from fighting the flood, their resources depleted, their population reduced by both the parasite and their own desperate measures to contain it. Against fresh Forerunner forces, they stood no chance. But here's what happened. In their war against humanity, the Forerunners inadvertently helped eliminate the flood. Every human world they sterilized, every human fleet they destroyed, removed potential flood vectors. The combined effect of humanity's desperate containment measures and the Forerunner campaign of extermination succeeded in pushing the parasite back. The flood receded from the galaxy, apparently destroyed or at least reduced to insignificance. Some interpretations suggest the flood may have deliberately withdrawn, waiting for a better moment to exact vengeance on the Forerunners. When the war ended with humanity's defeat, the Forerunners were left with questions they couldn't answer. Human prisoners, interrogated about their actions, consistently told the same story about fighting a parasite, about making terrible choices to prevent something worse. Some Forerunner investigators, particularly among the life workers, began to believe these accounts. But the war was over. Humanity was defeated, and the official narrative was set. Humans had been aggressors who attacked Forerunner clients. They'd been justly defeated. As punishment for their perceived crimes, and to ensure they could never threaten Forerunner authority again, humanity was genetically regressed. Their civilization was dismantled, their technology destroyed, their very biology altered to reduce them to a pre-technological state. They were scattered across a single world, Earth, to start over from scratch. It was genocide of culture and capability, if not of body. The erasure of everything ancient humanity had achieved. But some Forerunners, led by the librarian, recognized this punishment as unjust. If humans had truly been fighting the parasite they described, if their actions had been desperate measures against an existential threat, then the Forerunners hadn't defeated aggressors. They'd destroyed the species that had been fighting to save the galaxy. And they'd done so because of their own guilty inability to accept that the Precursors might have been right about humanity's worthiness. The librarian arranged for genetic imprints to be hidden in the human genome, seeds of recovery that would allow humanity to eventually reclaim what had been taken. She did this in secret, against the didact's wishes, because she believed that the Mantle of Responsibility had to mean something more than just power. If humanity had truly shown greater worthiness than the Forerunners through their sacrifice, then they deserved the chance to rise again. Meanwhile, the Forerunners believed they'd won. They'd defeated the one species that threatened their authority. They'd proven through force that they were the rightful bearers of the mantle. The galaxy was secure under their stewardship, and the mysterious parasite that humanity claimed to have been fighting, it was apparently extinct, or had never existed in the form humans described. This complacency lasted for thousands of years. Then the flood returned. Not from beyond the galactic rim this time, but from within Forerunner space itself. Ancient powder, still hidden in countless locations, was disturbed by Forerunner exploration or construction. Infected specimens in stasis were accidentally released. However it happened, the flood emerged again. And this time, it was the Forerunners who would face its full horror. The Forerunners' first response was confident. They'd defeated ancient humanity, a peer military power. Surely they could handle what appeared to be a parasitic outbreak. They established quarantine protocols, deployed military forces to infected regions, and began researching countermeasures. Initial encounters suggested this would be a manageable threat. They were catastrophically wrong. The flood that returned wasn't the same force ancient humanity had fought. It had learned from that encounter. It had adapted its strategies. And, most importantly, it had accumulated enough biomass and neural tissue in its initial outbreaks to achieve something the Forerunners didn't think was possible. The flood developed a grave mind. A unified superintelligence formed from the collected consciousness of billions of infected beings. The grave mind changed everything. This wasn't a disease or even a coordinated parasite anymore. It was a cosmic intelligence that remembered being Precursor, that carried within it the hatred and desire for revenge of murdered gods. When Forerunner forces encountered it, when they attempted to negotiate or understand what they were facing, the grave mind told them the truth. It was the Precursor's vengeance. It was punishment for the Forerunner's ultimate sin. And it would not stop until every Forerunner had paid the price for their ancestors' betrayal. Forerunner Flood War lasted for centuries and consumed the galaxy. It was unlike any conflict that had come before, because one side wasn't fighting to conquer or gain resources. The flood fought to punish, to consume, to unite all life in eternal suffering. Every victory the Forerunners achieved was temporary. Every loss was permanent, as fallen soldiers and destroyed populations became new biomass for the flood to use.
The didact, recalled from exile to lead the Forerunner military, initially believed the war could be won through conventional means. He deployed vast fleets, established defensive perimeters, and used the full might of Forerunner technology to contain and eliminate flood outbreaks. For a while, this seemed to work. The flood was pushed back, its presence reduced to isolated pockets that could be sterilized. But
the flood wasn't fighting a conventional war. Every engagement taught it more about Forerunner tactics and technology. As it consumed Forerunner warriors and technicians, it absorbed their knowledge and memories. The grave mind at the center of the collective intelligence grew more sophisticated with each mind it assimilated. It began to understand not just Forerunner military strategy, but Forerunner psychology, philosophy, culture. It learned what frightened them, what they valued, what they believed. The grave mind used this knowledge with horrifying effectiveness. It would send infected Forerunners back to their own lines, individuals who looked and acted almost normal until they suddenly transformed, spreading infection behind the defensive perimeters. It would target worlds of cultural or religious significance, forcing the Forerunners to choose between protecting their heritage and maintaining strategic positions. It would preserve certain infected individuals intact, using them to broadcast taunts and philosophical arguments to Forerunner forces, breaking down morale by demonstrating that even the mighty could be reduced to puppets. One of the grave mind's most devastating tactics was psychological warfare through revelation. It told the Forerunners what it claimed to be the corrupted remains of Precursors, returned to punish them for ancient betrayal. Whether this was literal truth or psychological manipulation based on corrupted memories, the effect was devastating. It offered them detailed descriptions of what infection meant, how it would transform them, the nature of the collective consciousness they would join. This psychological dimension created a terror beyond the physical threat. Forerunners who faced the flood knew they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting against damnation, against an enemy that didn't want to kill them, but to make them suffer forever as part of itself. Suicide became common among cornered troops who preferred death to infection. Entire populations chose sterilization over the risk of flood transformation. The will to resist was undermined by the sheer existential horror of what defeat meant. The Forerunner builders, led by the master builder Faber, proposed what they believed was the ultimate solution: the halo rings. These weapons would use neural physics, ironically the same exotic science the Precursors had pioneered, to destroy all neural tissue within their blast radius. Fire a halo and every sentient being within range would simply die, their consciousness erased instantly. No pain, no transformation, just clean extinction. The strategic logic was brutal but clear. The flood required biomass to survive and spread. Deny it hosts and it would die. If the Forerunners could eliminate all sentient life in flood-infected regions, they could contain the parasite by starving it. Yes, this meant killing countless innocent beings, but it was necessary sacrifice to save the galaxy. The Mantle of Responsibility in this interpretation meant making hard choices that lesser species couldn't stomach.
The didact opposed the Halo solution vehemently. He argued that using such weapons violated every principle the mantle was supposed to represent. You couldn't be a shepherd of life while wielding weapons designed for galactic genocide. He proposed alternative strategies: defensive perimeters, aggressive containment, using specialized warriors immune to flood infection. His arguments were passionate and principled, rooted in genuine belief that there had to be a better way. But the didact's strategies weren't working. For every flood outbreak he contained, 2 more appeared elsewhere. The parasite was spreading faster than it could be eliminated. Worlds that had been cleansed would become reinfected. The defensive perimeters were collapsing. And most devastatingly, the flood was learning to use Forerunner technology itself, corrupting their installations, turning their weapons against them. The final straw came when the flood managed to capture and control a significant Forerunner installation, including its defensive AI. This proved that nowhere was truly safe, that the Forerunners' technological superiority was becoming irrelevant. The flood could learn, could adapt, could eventually turn every advantage into a liability. The war wasn't just going poorly. It was becoming unwinnable through conventional means. The Master Builder won the debate through grim necessity. The Halo rings were constructed, massive installations orbiting key positions throughout the galaxy. Each was a weapon of devastating power, capable of sterilizing all sentient life within 25,000 light years. Together, the array could cover the entire galaxy, ending all complex life in a single coordinated firing. But even as the Halos were being built, the librarian and her life workers were working on a different project. If the rings were going to fire, if all life in the galaxy was going to be extinguished, then there needed to be a way to reseed civilization afterward. She began cataloging species, preserving genetic samples, indexing the biodiversity of millions of worlds. Her plan was ambitious and heartbreaking. Save what could be saved, then restore it after the flood was dead. This was the Forerunners' final solution to the problem they'd created millions of years earlier. They would commit genocide on a galactic scale to undo the consequences of committing genocide against their creators. The poetry was lost on no one. The species that had murdered the Precursors to claim the mantle would prove their unworthiness by destroying everything the mantle was meant to protect. The Gravemind understood what was being planned and moved to counter it. It began a massive offensive, trying to capture the Halo installations before they could be fired. The final battles were apocalyptic, with the flood throwing billions of infected forms against Forerunner positions. Entire star systems became war zones. Some Forerunner worlds chose to fire their local defense weapons early, sterilizing themselves rather than risk flood capture. During this desperate endgame, encounters with the Gravemind revealed disturbing claims. It asserted that it was indeed connected to the Precursors, that what the Forerunners had done millions of years ago had led directly to this punishment. Whether these claims were literal truth or emerged from corrupted Precursor memories twisted by millions of years remains open to interpretation. But their psychological impact was undeniable. The Gravemind also revealed knowledge about the mantle that the Precursors had never shared with the Forerunners. It explained that the mantle wasn't just a philosophy, but something deeper, a fundamental principle of the universe that certain species were naturally aligned with. The Forerunners had never truly understood what they'd stolen, because they weren't meant to bear it. They'd spent millions of years trying to fulfill a role they were fundamentally unsuited for, and their failure had been inevitable from the moment they betrayed their creators. This revelation was devastating to the Forerunners who heard it. Everything they'd built, everything they'd believed about themselves, was based on a lie. They'd convinced themselves that power and achievement proved worthiness, that their management of the galaxy validated their claim to the mantle. But the Gravemind showed them that they'd never been worthy, that their entire civilization was built on stolen authority they couldn't properly wield. The Didact, confronting the Gravemind directly during one of the final battles, tried to negotiate. He offered surrender, offered to help rebuild the Precursors, offered anything to avoid the necessity of firing the halos. But the Gravemind refused. This wasn't about restoration. It was about punishment. The Flood wanted the Forerunners to understand exactly what they'd done, to face the consequences of their ancient sin, to suffer as the Precursors had suffered. The Gravemind made one final offer to the Didact personally. It could preserve him in the Flood Collective, could give him effective immortality by making him part of its consciousness. He would experience the unity the Precursors had originally intended, would finally understand what the mantle truly meant. All he had to do was accept infection, become one with the collective intelligence. The Didact refused, but the offer haunted him for the rest of his existence. With no other options remaining, the librarian convinced the remaining Forerunner leadership to activate the Halo Array. She'd finished her work cataloging and indexing species. The evacuation of samples to the Ark, a facility beyond the galaxy's rim where they'd be protected from the Halo's blast, was complete. Everything that could be saved was saved. It was time to fire the weapons that would end everything. The activation was delayed by desperate
Flood assaults on the control facilities. The Gravemind knew what was coming and threw everything it had at preventing the firing, but the Forerunners held long enough. The signal was sent. Across the galaxy, the Halo rings activated simultaneously, their energy pulses expanding at the speed of light, killing every sentient being in range. The Flood died first, its biomass suddenly lifeless as the neural tissue it required was destroyed. Then the Forerunners themselves, the species that had built the weapons, experienced their own extinction. Every world, every installation, every ship in the galaxy became silent as its inhabitants simply stopped existing. The great Forerunner civilization, millions of years old and spanning countless worlds, ended in hours. The librarian survived, having positioned herself on Earth to ensure humanity's genetic samples were properly stored. She died shortly after the rings fired, having witnessed the extinction of her entire species to stop the horror they'd unleashed. Her final act was to leave messages and imprints for the species that would inherit the reseeded galaxy, particularly humanity, whom she still believed the Precursors had been right to choose. The didact also survived, but his fate was darker. He'd been imprisoned by the Master Builder before the halos fired, sealed in a combat cryptum where he would remain in stasis. When he eventually awakened thousands of years later, it would be to a galaxy he didn't recognize, populated by humans he still hated for their perceived crimes. His survival ensured that the old conflicts would continue, that the sins of the past would haunt the future. Chapter 6: Humanity's Role and the Reclaimers. When the halo rings fired, they ended an epoch. The galaxy was sterilized of complex life, leaving only the most basic organisms that didn't possess the neural complexity to be affected. For thousands of years, the galaxy was essentially empty, a vast graveyard littered with the ruins of Forerunner civilization and the fossilized remains of countless species. But the librarian's plan for restoration began to unfold. Automated systems on the Ark started the reseeding process. Species that had been indexed were cloned and returned to their homeworlds or suitable substitute planets. Entire ecosystems were reconstructed from genetic templates. The galaxy slowly came back to life, though the species that now inhabited it had no memory of what had come before. Humanity was among the species restored. The genetic samples from ancient humanity, before their regression by the Forerunners, were used to recreate the species on Earth. But the librarian had done something additional. She'd embedded Gaias within the human genome, genetic imprints that would guide humanity's development over millennia. These weren't just instructions for physical development. They were philosophical directives, nudges toward certain behaviors and choices that would prepare humanity to eventually reclaim the mantle. These Gaias were subtle, working across countless generations. They influenced humanity's curiosity, our drive to explore and expand, our capacity for sacrifice and cooperation. They also included specific triggers that would activate in certain individuals when they encountered Forerunner technology. These triggered humans, called Reclaimers, would find themselves able to interact with Forerunner systems as if they had the proper authorization, because genetically they did. The librarian had left humanity positioned to inherit what the Forerunners had lost. She'd given them the tools and inclinations necessary to eventually bear the Mantle of Responsibility, to become the species the Precursors had originally chosen. But she'd also left them ignorant of the full history, of the horrors that had led to the Halo's firing, perhaps believing that knowledge of such profound tragedy would be too heavy a burden for a developing civilization. Humanity developed naturally for thousands of years, progressing from primitive hunter-gatherers to spacefaring civilization without any overt intervention. The Gaias worked in the background, invisible to everyone, including the humans they affected. We attributed our achievements to our own ingenuity, never knowing we'd been given subtle guidance by a dead Forerunner who believed in our potential. The discovery of Forerunner artifacts changed everything. When humanity finally developed spaceflight and began exploring nearby systems, we encountered ruins of the ancient civilization. These installations were still functional despite being abandoned for millennia. Their technology so advanced that we could barely comprehend it. And some humans, those with active reclaimer Gaias, could interact with these systems in ways that seemed impossible. This led to the formation of the United Nations Space Command and humanity's aggressive expansion into space. We reverse-engineered what Forerunner technology we could understand, using it to accelerate our own development. We had no idea we were following a path that had been laid out for us, that our very ability to use this technology was proof of our intended inheritance. Then we encountered the Covenant, and everything became vastly more complicated. This alliance of alien species worshipped the Forerunners as gods, had built their entire religion around the belief that the Forerunners had achieved divine transcendence through the halo rings. When the Covenant discovered humanity could activate Forerunner technology, could interact with sacred artifacts that should have been beyond any living species' access, it shattered their theological framework. The Covenant's response was genocidal. Humanity's very existence was heresy, proof that their entire religion might be wrong. Rather than confronting this possibility, the Covenant's leadership decided to eliminate the evidence. They declared humanity an affront to the sacred Forerunners and began a war of extinction that would last decades and kill billions. What the Covenant didn't understand, what almost no one understood, was that humanity's ability to use Forerunner technology wasn't desecration. It was inheritance. We were the reclaimers, the species the Forerunners had prepared to take their place. The librarian had seen to that, had ensured that when humanity finally reached the stars, we'd find the tools we needed to fulfill the destiny the Precursors had intended for our ancient ancestors. The Human Covenant War was, in a sense, a continuation of conflicts that had begun millions of years earlier. The Covenant's religious devotion to the Forerunners echoed the Forerunners' own conviction of their worthiness to bear the mantle. Humanity's desperate fight for survival paralleled ancient humanity's war against both the Flood and the Forerunners. The same themes of worthiness, of who deserved to inherit cosmic responsibility, were being played out again with different actors. The war's climax came when both humans and Covenant forces discovered and activated halo rings, not understanding what they truly were. The rings weren't divine instruments of transcendence. They were weapons of genocide. Last resorts built by a desperate civilization to destroy the Flood and themselves. The Covenant's religious leaders knew this, but had hidden the truth from their followers, maintaining the lie that the halos were paths to godhood. Master Chief, the human super soldier who became central to the conflict, was a reclaimer par excellence. His genetic makeup included particularly strong Gaius triggers that allowed him to interact with Forerunner systems more effectively than almost any other human. He was, in a sense, exactly what the librarian had hoped to create. A human capable of wielding Forerunner technology in defense of life, rather than its destruction.
When the Covenant attempted to fire a halo ring, believing it would grant them transcendence, Master Chief and his AI companion Cortana stopped them. They prevented a second galactic extinction, saving not just humanity, but all the species in the galaxy from the halo's indiscriminate sterilization. This act of preservation, of prioritizing life above all else, was precisely what the Mantle of Responsibility had originally meant in the Precursors' conception. The revelation of the Halo's true purpose shattered the Covenant. The Alliance fractured as member species learned their religious leaders had lied to them for centuries. The war ended not with humanity's extinction, but with the Covenant's dissolution. And humanity was left as one of the dominant military powers in the galaxy, positioned exactly where the librarian had intended us to be. But this position came with questions and responsibilities we weren't prepared for. ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, began uncovering more complete records of ancient history through deeper study of Forerunner installations. They learned about the Precursors, about the
Forerunners' betrayal, about ancient humanity's war and regression. They discovered that our current civilization was essentially the Forerunners' second chance, an attempt to correct their ancient mistake by preparing humanity to succeed where they had failed. This knowledge was deeply troubling. Were we really worthy of the mantle? Or were we just following programming embedded in our genes by a dead alien who'd felt guilty about her species' crimes? Did we have genuine agency, or were we puppets dancing to Forerunner designs? And most critically, did we want the responsibility the mantle represented, knowing what it had driven the Forerunners to do? The Didact's awakening complicated these questions further. When Master Chief inadvertently released him from his cryptum, the ancient Forerunner brought with him all the prejudices and hatreds of his era. To the Didact, humanity was still the species that had attacked Forerunner clients, still unworthy of the mantle, still deserving of regression or extinction. The librarian's plans meant nothing to him. He would not allow humans to inherit what was rightfully Forerunner property. The Didact's attempt to use a Forerunner device called the Composer to digitize and destroy human populations was stopped by Master Chief, but it revealed the depths of resentment that still existed from ancient conflicts. The Didact represented the Forerunner civilization at its worst, convinced of its own superiority, willing to commit atrocities in the name of the mantle, unable to accept that it might have been wrong about its fundamental beliefs. Confronting the Didact forced humanity to examine what we truly believed about the mantle. Did we want to follow the Forerunner model, imposing order and control on other species because we believed we knew better? Or could we find a different interpretation, one closer to what the Precursors had originally intended? The fact that we were having these debates, questioning rather than assuming our worthiness, suggested we might actually be capable of bearing the responsibility. The librarian's imprinted memories, encountered by Master Chief during his mission, provided some guidance. She explained that the mantle wasn't about power or control. It was about service and sacrifice, about accepting limitations on your own freedom to ensure others could thrive. The Forerunners had failed because they'd become convinced that their judgment was always correct, that disagreement with them was proof of unworthiness in others rather than potential error on their part. She urged humanity to remember humility, to understand that bearing the mantle meant accepting that you might be wrong, that other species might have valid perspectives, even when they conflicted with yours. This was wisdom born from watching her own species destroy itself through arrogance. If humanity could learn from Forerunner mistakes rather than repeating them, we might succeed where they had failed. But the question remained: should we even try? The mantle had brought nothing but tragedy to those who'd claimed it. The Precursors were destroyed by their students. The Forerunners destroyed themselves, trying to live up to ideals they'd stolen. Ancient humanity was regressed for trying to act responsibly in the face of the flood. Every species that had touched the mantle had suffered catastrophically. Perhaps the wisest choice was to reject it entirely, to let the philosophy of cosmic responsibility die with the civilizations it had doomed. Chapter 7. The Philosophy. Across millennia. The mantle of responsibility across its millions of years of existence has proven to be both incredibly enduring and catastrophically destructive. Understanding why requires examining what the philosophy actually claims and how those claims interact with the reality of wielding power on a galactic scale. At its heart, the mantle proposes that consciousness creates obligation. If you're aware enough to understand that other beings can suffer, intelligent enough to prevent or alleviate that suffering, and powerful enough to act on that understanding, then you have a moral duty to do so. This seems uncontroversial as stated. Most ethical systems acknowledge that capability creates some level of responsibility. But the mantle goes further. It suggests that this obligation scales with capability. The more advanced you are, the more responsibility you bear. At a certain level of advancement, this responsibility becomes your primary obligation, superseding your species' own interests. You're no longer just responsible for yourself or your immediate community. You're responsible for the entire ecosystem of consciousness in the galaxy. This creates immediate practical problems. How do you balance the needs of your own species against the needs of others? If protecting a developing civilization requires sacrificing resources your own people need, what's the right choice? If two species are in conflict and both have valid grievances, how do you decide which to support? The mantle provides a philosophical framework, but doesn't offer clear answers to these practical dilemmas. The Precursors handled these problems through their almost godlike capabilities. They had sufficient resources and power that protecting other species rarely required genuine sacrifice. They could nurture countless civilizations simultaneously without depleting themselves. But when they passed the mantle's responsibility to species less cosmically powerful, those species faced impossible choices that the Precursors had never confronted. The Forerunners interpreted the mantle in ways that conveniently aligned with their own interests. They claimed to act in service to other species, but their actual policies gave them final authority over galactic affairs. Client species were protected and guided,
but they were also controlled and limited. The Forerunners decided which technologies other species could access,
which worlds they could settle, which civilizations could interact. This was stewardship that looked an awful lot like imperialism. This drift from service to control was probably inevitable, given the power dynamics. When one species is overwhelmingly more advanced than all others, when they have the capability to destroy civilizations easily, genuine equality becomes nearly impossible. Other species might be nominally independent, but they exist at Forerunner sufferance. The benevolence of your overlords is still overlordship. The Forerunners tried to justify this through appeals to the mantle. They weren't dominating other species for their own benefit. They were protecting the weak from the strong, preventing conflicts that lesser species couldn't resolve themselves, ensuring that the galaxy remained diverse and life-rich. And genuinely, many Forerunners believed this. They saw themselves as selfless servants bearing a heavy burden. But this self-image masked deeper truths. The Forerunners benefited enormously from their interpretation of the mantle. It justified their territorial expansion, their access to resources, their authority over other species. It allowed them to feel noble about a system that primarily served their interests. The fact that they genuinely believed they were serving the greater good made them more dangerous, not less, because they couldn't recognize when their actions betrayed their principles. This is perhaps the mantle's deepest flaw as a practical philosophy. It requires the powerful to judge their own worthiness, to evaluate their own actions against standards they've set for themselves. The conflict of interest is obvious. Every empire in history has convinced itself that its dominance was justified, that it ruled for the benefit of its subjects, that resistance was proof of ignorance rather than genuine grievance. The Forerunners were no different despite their philosophical sophistication. They did these things believing they were necessary, that the alternative of allowing the flood to spread was worse than the atrocities required to stop it. And they were probably right in that calculation. But being right doesn't make you good. Committing necessary evil is still committing evil. The mantle's promise of righteousness through responsibility created a trap. It suggested that if you were acting to protect life generally, then specific violations of that principle could be justified. The needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few, and someone had to make those terrible calculations. But once you start justifying atrocities through appeals to greater good, where do you stop? Every tyrant in history has claimed to be protecting something greater than the people they're currently oppressing. The flood itself can be understood as a dark mirror of the mantle. The corrupted Precursors believed they were still acting as cosmic shepherds, still fulfilling their responsibility to guide and shape life. They'd simply concluded that life as it currently existed was flawed beyond redemption and needed to be unified through absorption. In their twisted logic, assimilating all consciousness into a single collective
was the ultimate expression of the Mantle's call for unity and interconnection. This horrifying inversion reveals something disturbing about the Mantle's core claims. If consciousness creates obligation, if advanced beings must shepherd lesser ones, then who's to say the Flood's method is wrong? It eliminates suffering by eliminating individual consciousness. It creates perfect unity by destroying diversity. It solves the problem of conflict by making conflict impossible. These are grotesque solutions, but they're solutions nonetheless. And they're justified by the same basic logic the Mantle itself employs. The difference, presumably, is that the Mantle respects individual autonomy and diversity, while the Flood destroys both. But the Forerunners also violated autonomy and reduced diversity when they deemed it necessary. They destroyed ancient humanity's civilization and regressed the species genetically, eliminating cultural and technological diversity in pursuit of what they believed was justice. How is that fundamentally different from what the Flood does, beyond scale and methodology? These questions aren't just philosophical abstractions. They're practical problems that any species attempting to bear the Mantle must confront. When does protection become control? When does stewardship become tyranny? When does the responsibility to preserve life justify destroying some life to save more? The Mantle provides no clear answers because perhaps no clear answers exist. Modern humanity, inheriting this philosophical mess, has the advantage of historical perspective. We've seen what the Mantle did to the Precursors, to the Forerunners, to our own ancient ancestors. We know the costs of cosmic responsibility and the ways it can be corrupted. This knowledge should make us wiser, more cautious about claiming authority we might not be equipped to wield responsibly. But knowledge of past failures doesn't guarantee future success. Humanity has our own history of good intentions leading to catastrophe, of protective instincts becoming oppressive systems, of believing we knew better than the people we were supposedly helping. We're not inherently more worthy than the Forerunners were. We're just luckier to have their example as warning, rather than having to learn those lessons ourselves through equally catastrophic mistakes. The question facing humanity isn't whether we can bear the Mantle perfectly. We can't. No species can. Because the Mantle demands perfection in judgment, while giving power that makes mistakes catastrophic. The question is whether we can bear it better than those who came before, whether we can learn from their errors, whether we can build systems that constrain our worst impulses while enabling our best intentions. One possibility is rejecting the Mantle's core premise that advanced species should have authority over less advanced ones. Perhaps the solution isn't finding better shepherds, but eliminating shepherding entirely. Let each species develop on its own, face its own challenges, make its own mistakes. Provide assistance when requested, but don't impose guidance or control. This respects autonomy, but accepts that some species will fail, will destroy themselves or others, when intervention might have prevented it. Another approach is democratizing the Mantle, making it a shared responsibility rather than one species' burden. Instead of one advanced species making decisions for everyone, create interspecies institutions where different perspectives can be voiced and considered. This reduces the risk of any one species' biases dominating, but it creates coordination problems and political complexities that might paralyze decision-making when quick action is needed. A third option is accepting the mantle, but with radical transparency and accountability. If humanity acts as cosmic steward, we do so knowing that our actions will be judged by those we affect and by future generations. We document our reasoning, accept that we'll be wrong sometimes, and build mechanisms for correction when we err. This doesn't prevent mistakes, but makes them visible and potentially correctable, rather than hidden behind claims of superior judgment. None of these approaches is perfect. Each has situations where it would fail catastrophically. But perhaps that's the real lesson of the mantle's history. There is no perfect system for wielding cosmic-scale power responsibly. Any approach will involve tragedy, will require choices where every option is bad. The question is whether you accept that burden knowing you'll fail, partially, or whether you reject the responsibility entirely and accept the different tragedies that result from inaction. The librarian chose to accept the burden knowing she'd fail. She couldn't save the Forerunner civilization that was destroying itself. She couldn't prevent the halo firing that would kill everything. But she could preserve what she could set conditions for life to return, could try to prepare humanity to do better than her species had done. It was acceptance of limitation while still acting within those limits to do what good was possible. This might be the closest thing to wisdom the mantle's history offers. Not that you can succeed perfectly, but that you try anyway, knowing you'll fail partially. Not that you have all the answers, but that you act on the best answers you have, while remaining open to being wrong. Not that you're worthy of cosmic responsibility, but that you accept it anyway, because the alternative is abandoning other life to whatever fate awaits them without guidance or protection. The mantle of responsibility, viewed across millions of years and multiple civilizations, is a tragedy of good intentions and insufficient wisdom. It's a beautiful idea that becomes corrupted in practice, because wielding power on cosmic scales is beyond any species' true capability. But it's also an acknowledgement of something true and important, that consciousness creates obligation, that we can't ignore suffering we're capable of preventing, that power without responsibility is tyranny, while responsibility without power is uselessness. Humanity stands now where the Forerunners stood millions of years ago, at the threshold of claiming cosmic responsibility. We have some advantages they lacked. We know their history, their failures, their catastrophes. We've seen what happens when the mantle becomes justification for atrocity. We understand the traps and pitfalls that claimed previous bearers. But we also have the same weaknesses that doomed them. We're convinced of our own righteousness even when we shouldn't be. We justify terrible actions through appeals to greater good. We assume we know better than those we're supposedly protecting. We're human, with all the flaws that implies, trying to bear a responsibility that might require something beyond human capability. The Precursors created a philosophy that was too pure for any imperfect species to bear successfully. The Forerunners proved that power and good intentions aren't sufficient. Ancient humanity showed that even desperate necessity doesn't excuse all actions. And the flood demonstrated what happens when the mantle's logic is taken to its ultimate, horrifying conclusion. What remains is the question that has haunted the galaxy for millions of years. Can any species truly be worthy of cosmic responsibility? Or is the mantle of responsibility itself the problem? A philosophy that sounds noble, but leads inevitably to catastrophe, regardless of who attempts to bear it. Conclusion: the legacy of the first philosophy. We've journeyed through millions of years of galactic history, from the Precursors' original conception of cosmic responsibility, through the Forerunners' catastrophic attempt to claim it, to humanity's current position as potential inheritors. The mantle of responsibility has shaped every major event in Halo's universe, has justified genocides and guided noble acts, has been both the best and worst impulse of advanced civilizations. What becomes clear through this examination is that the mantle is less a solution to the problems of cosmic coexistence and more a framework for thinking about those problems. It doesn't provide answers so much as pose questions. What do we owe to other forms of life? What obligations come with power? How do we balance our own interests against the interests of others? When is intervention justified, and when is it imperialism disguised as protection? The Precursors thought they had answers to these questions. They had spent billions of years observing life, guiding evolution, nurturing consciousness. They believed they understood what cosmic stewardship required and could teach those principles to their created species. Yet they failed to account for how differently those principles would be interpreted by beings less powerful and more insecure than themselves. The Forerunners thought they had better answers. They had studied the mantle for millions of years, built an entire civilization around its principles, and demonstrated through their actions that they could protect and guide other species effectively. Still, they could not see how their own overwhelming power corrupted their judgment, making them blind to when protection became control. Ancient humanity thought they had found necessary answers. Facing the existential threat of the flood, they made terrible choices in service of galactic survival, believing any price was justified to prevent the horror of complete flood victory. But their reasoning went unshared and misunderstood, leaving them condemned for actions they believed righteous. The flood is the answer that emerges when cosmic responsibility is combined with absolute hatred. It fulfills the mantle's call for unity and guidance by destroying individual will, creates order by eliminating the possibility of disorder, and solves the problem of suffering by absorbing all consciousness into a collective that suffers together eternally. It is the darkest possible implementation of the mantle's principles. And now humanity stands with the question before us: do we accept the mantle that the Precursors intended for us, that the librarian prepared us to bear? Do we try to succeed where the Forerunners failed, learning from their mistakes and attempting better stewardship? Or do we reject the entire framework, arguing that cosmic responsibility is inherently corrupting, and that any attempt to bear it will end in tragedy?
There are arguments for each position. Accepting the mantle means accepting that we might make catastrophic mistakes, that our good intentions might lead to horrors, that we might become the next cautionary tale for future species. But it also means accepting that we have power, and that power unused is still a choice, one that has consequences for those who suffer because we chose not to act. Rejecting the mantle means accepting that preventable suffering will occur, that species will die that we could have saved, that the galaxy will develop without guidance that might have helped it avoid catastrophes. But it also means avoiding the particular corruption that comes from believing you're responsible for everyone, from assuming you know better than those you're supposedly protecting. Perhaps the wisest approach is somewhere between these extremes. Accept that we have some responsibility to use our power ethically, to help where we can, without imposing our will on those who don't want our guidance. Acknowledge that we'll never be truly worthy of cosmic responsibility, because no one is. But that unworthiness doesn't excuse inaction when action might prevent suffering. The mantle's history teaches us to be humble about our capabilities while still acting on our best judgment. It shows us that good intentions aren't sufficient, but also that they matter. It demonstrates that power without wisdom is catastrophic, but that wisdom without power is irrelevant. It reveals that cosmic responsibility is impossible to bear perfectly, but that bearing it imperfectly might still be better than not bearing it at all. The Precursors created the first philosophy of the galaxy, a framework for thinking about how advanced civilizations should relate to developing ones. That philosophy has caused immense suffering through its various implementations. It justified the Forerunners' murder of their creators. It rationalized ancient humanity's genocidal war. It drove the Forerunners to fire weapons that sterilized the galaxy. It transformed corrupted gods into the most horrifying force the universe has known. But the same philosophy also inspired the librarian's work to preserve and restore life after the halo firing. It motivated countless acts of protection and nurturing across millions of years. It created a framework where advanced species at least considered their obligations to others, rather than simply exploiting the weak. For all its failures and corruptions, the Mantle of Responsibility represented an attempt to solve real problems about how power should be wielded. The question isn't whether the mantle is perfect. It clearly isn't. The question is whether it's better than the alternatives, whether galaxies guided by some interpretation of cosmic responsibility are better than galaxies where might makes right and power acknowledges no ethical constraints. The evidence is mixed and probably depends on which interpretation of the mantle is implemented and by whom. Master Chief, the human reclaimer who has been at the center of modern conflicts, embodies perhaps the healthiest relationship with the mantle. He doesn't claim to be worthy of cosmic responsibility. He doesn't believe he has answers others lack. He simply acts according to his best judgment in each situation, trying to protect people he cares about and people who need protection. He makes mistakes, fails sometimes, but keeps trying because the alternative is abandoning those who need help. This pragmatic heroism without cosmic pretension might be the version of the mantle that actually works. Not I bear responsibility for the galaxy because I'm worthy, but I bear responsibility for these people in this situation because I'm here and I can help. Not claiming perfect judgment, but acting on limited information because action is necessary. Not assuming superiority, but recognizing capability and using it ethically. If humanity does inherit the mantle in any meaningful sense, perhaps this is how we should bear it. Not as cosmic overlords convinced of our righteousness, but as reluctant stewards doing our best with limited wisdom. Not claiming authority over other species, but accepting responsibility for our own actions and their consequences. Not believing we deserve power, but using power we have in ways that minimize harm and maximize benefit according to our best but admittedly flawed judgment. The precursors are gone, destroyed by those they tried to teach. The Forerunners are extinct, killed by weapons they built to correct their own mistakes. Ancient humanity was scattered and regressed, punished for actions they believed necessary. The flood waits in the corners of the galaxy, corrupted divinity that might return if conditions allow. And humanity inherits all of this history, all of these lessons written in the blood of civilizations. We didn't ask for this inheritance. We didn't choose to be positioned as potential bearers of cosmic responsibility. The precursors chose us for reasons we may never fully understand. The librarian prepared us for a role we didn't know existed. And now we're here, powerful enough to affect the galaxy, knowledgeable enough to understand what that power means, but hopefully wise enough to recognize we're not wise enough to wield it perfectly. This is the legacy of the first philosophy of the galaxy. Not clear answers, but important questions. Not guaranteed success, but cautionary examples of failure. Not divine mandate, but the heavy burden of capability meeting consciousness, of power confronting obligation. The mantle of responsibility isn't a path to righteousness. It's an acknowledgement that we must try to be responsible, even knowing we'll fail partially, because the alternative is abandoning responsibility entirely and accepting the different tragedies that follow. As we close this exploration of precursor philosophy and its consequences, remember that these aren't just ancient events in a fictional universe. They're meditations on real questions that humanity actually faces. We have increasing power to affect the world around us, to alter ecosystems, to influence other species, to shape the future of life on Earth. What obligations come with that power? How do we wield it responsibly? When does protection become control? These are mantle questions, and we're living through our own version of them. The Precursors' gift to the galaxy wasn't just biological life, it was philosophical life. The question of how conscious beings should treat each other and the universe they inhabit. That question remains unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable in any final sense. But it remains worth asking, worth struggling with, worth attempting to address, even knowing we'll never solve it perfectly. Fear the old blood, Master Willem warned in a different universe. Fear the mantle, we might say in this one. Fear cosmic responsibility and the corruptions it enables, but also recognize that fear isn't sufficient reason for inaction, that the burden must be borne even if bearing it is guaranteed to involve tragedy and error. The first philosophy of the galaxy teaches us humility about our capabilities and determination despite our limitations. It shows us that good intentions matter even when they're insufficient. It demonstrates that power creates obligation even when we're unworthy of that power. And it reminds us that consciousness itself is a kind of sacred trust, something that must be protected and nurtured even at great cost. Because the alternative is accepting that intelligence and awareness have no particular value beyond survival. The Precursors created the Mantle of Responsibility as an answer to how advanced life should behave. Their answer has been tested across millions of years and found incomplete but not entirely wrong. Perhaps that's the best any philosophy can hope for. Not perfection, but gradual improvement. Not final answers, but better questions. Not worthiness achieved, but worthiness pursued, despite knowing the pursuit will never truly succeed. Humanity's story in the Halo universe is still being written. We don't know yet whether we'll succeed as bearers of the mantle where others failed, or whether we'll add our catastrophe to the long list of species broken by cosmic responsibility. But we know the history now. We understand the stakes. We recognize the traps that claimed the Precursors, the Forerunners, our own ancient ancestors. That knowledge won't guarantee success, but it gives us a fighting chance. And in a universe as harsh and unforgiving as Halo's, where gods die and galaxies burn and entire civilizations are extinguished in hours, a fighting chance might be the best anyone can hope for. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the deepest lore in the Halo universe. of the philosophy that explains why the rings exist and what they represent. The Mantle of Responsibility is more than just world building. It's a meditation on power, obligation, and the impossible burden of trying to do right on a cosmic scale. Until next time, may you bear your own responsibilities with wisdom and humility, knowing that perfection is impossible, but trying is mandatory. And may you remember that the greatest catastrophes often come not from evil intentions, but from good intentions wielded with insufficient wisdom. Good night, Reclaimers. The mantle awaits your judgment.